I want to first start out by thanking Don for his characteristic generosity in bringing us together here for indeed its time. I was there for but one of those. It's been quite a wild and beneficial trip. I want to, of course, thank Paul for conceiving this, or at least pitching it to us 2 editorial meetings ago, and managed to get us all to commit. I'm going to do indeed a reprise, and the first reprise is on the title, because I've changed it. I put the title out in the spirit of the pink issue, which when I was first asked to join this group in 1990, I studied very carefully. It was a humbling invitation. And then when I was brought on to the collective in 1995, I think the first person who wasn't part of what I call the constitutional collective, I read it again because it was truly a ground-breaking issue, and I still have 3 copies of it in my basement, which I'm not giving up. So when I was brought on, it was an unusual moment in some sense, and the invitation was very much in keeping with the spirit of the journal, as Bill conceived it and as Paul just described it. And so I was given an opportunity to put forward some of my thinking around a problem that I've been looking at for some years, and that manifested itself in my 3rd published essay. Unfortunately, I published also before I published in the journal, and that was on the question of neo-authenticity. And there's been a whole series of essays that have followed. In that same vein, when I was asked to join the collective officially in 1995, I opened up another vector that has been for me a defining vector, going back to 1973 in terms of intellectual history, further back in terms of personal history. And that was Algeria, France, Fanon, and problematics of the era. In some sense, this project is caught under the title of a talk that Senghor gave in '68 at Cairo University. Africanité et Arabité. And so what I've decided to do here is, in keeping with this being a reprise, and I've written 35 pages, present a paper that brings together those 2 projects and spells out what that ambition has been. Hence the change. Fanon is not lost, but hence the change in title. Restless Flying, a black study of revolutionary humanism. Now, I have a complaint, and it's not directed to the journal, but it's a broad complaint. I just had Rutledge put out an essay of mine in a volume in which, no matter how hard I try to get them to pay attention, the Arabic is all scrambled. This, of course, has occurred as well in the title of this talk. The Arabic is all scrambled. But even though Edward wrote about this 30 years ago, we still have a publishing situation in which they can't get it right? And this is something we're going to have to address at some point. À quelque niveau, elle est dit, la décolonisation est très simplement le rapprochement d'un espace d'un pour un autre espace d'un. Sans tradition, il y a substitution totale, complète, absolute. These lines we know. These are the opening lines of L'éternel de la Terre. What I want to begin to explore is, what does it mean to say a new species of human? What's the doing of it? What's the work of it? Is it more than an abstract proposition? And hence, I began to explore this in a careful way under a very specific title, Restless Flying. Now, this brings together a number of pieces. Some of this you have heard before, but not in the same way. I'm going to sing it in a different pitch. Now, reference flying references and comprehends a reading of 2 poetic lines. They are refrains of different provenances, one Tunisian, one Caribbean, in different tongues, Arabic and French, yet with remarkable harmonic resonance. for reasons of greater linguistic distribution having to do with modern imperial expansion and a controversy between two well-known Francophone poets about the proper poetic legacy of that expansion, the French is more familiar. It is the opening couplet of the third strophe, or strophe, from Aimé Césaire's very famous 1955 poem, addressed to the young rising star Haitian poet René Depestre, which appeared in its first published version in Présence Africaine, a Tunisian journal, and still a Tunisian journal, by the way, under the title Réponse à Depestre, poète haïtien, élément d'un acte poétique. Mais renouerons-nous les Depestre, mais renouerons-les. Comme je dis, nous renouerons mettre our fouet. Let us fly away from them, Depestre, flying away from them as we already flew from the masters of the wit. Now, the controversy in question was initially prompted by Depestre's publishing a letter to the poet Charles Dubinsky in June 1955 issue of Les Lettres Françaises, where he embraces Aragon's argument for returning to classical measured rhyme as a way to galvanize national spirit. Since the French linguistic domain, he writes, has expanded beyond the national and geographical boundaries of France, it is natural that any debate raised on questions of form should also be the responsibility of those who have the honor, as a result of the avatars of the French political history, to share with you, French creators, the legacy of song, the legacy of prosody, the renewed continuation of the traditional measures proper to the development of poetry in France. Now, this was a provocation enough. He's Haitian, after all. But then Depestre proclaims that Aragon, in his genius and example, has shed light on what ought to be the direction of our Haitian poets, leaving us the responsibility, with the proper coefficient of our talent, to use the foreign material from the French domain. We must penetrate the essence of his approach to discern in the cultural heritage that comes to us from Africa what can be harmoniously integrated with the French prosodic language. We can see that. What drove Césaire to write in the second strophe of his poem in response, Fanon, cavalier de tam-tam, courageous tam-tam writer. Est-il vrai que tout doutait la forêt natale, de nous voir ronquer de nos cours qui nous remontaient à mer, de nos eaux et de roues rouges, de nos nuits insidiées. Is it true that you doubt the native voice and our hoarse voices, our hearts that come back up upon us, bitter, our rum-red eyes, our burned-out nights? Is it possible that the rains of exile, les pluies d'exil, have slackened the drum skin of your voice? Now, at the heart of the debate between Césaire and Depestre was the difference between a syncretic conceptualization of créolité, which construes the long historical event of modern European imperialism, Spanish, Dutch, French, Portuguese, and English, as engendering the circumscribing context for the perpetual convergence of indigenous African, Asian, and European forms, all of which constitute the full heritage of formal poetic expression and négritude, calling for a return to authentic African sensibilities as the basis of formal expression in French. Haiti is the historical epicenter for both poetic conceptions as a matter of historical precedence, as the place where a distinctive New World consciousness strives for political form. And the fact that the Article 14 of the 1805 Constitution expressly uses the dénomination générique de Noir to define Haitians regardless of color underscores the convergence of créolité and négritude in its base. I don't think I have to translate, right? Everybody hears. Do I have to translate? Good, because I won't. Black here is a conceptualization. Blackness. And blackness is a poetical, as in poesis, expression of what I term parasemiosis, which is a dynamic constitution of the world as a fluidity of multiple enactments of referentiality, whereby being human is enunciated in the flow. To say that blackness equates with Pan-Africanization denotes the historicity of Negro as a specific embodiment of sentient flesh in space and time. That is to say, the specific situation that instantiates its poesis. Yet insofar as that poesis is a function of parasemiosis, it is a potentiality of being that might very well attend any other embodiments of flesh. While indissolubly associated with Negro embodiment, blackness as semiosis, as parasemiosis, is not identical with black people, even though it indisputably belongs with them. In this sense, parasemiosis does indeed approximate glissance, réalisation. That is to say, a mode of forming a complex mix that is only exemplified by its processes and certainly not by its elements, certainly not by its contents on which these operate. The resonance is fine. Indeed, it is perisemiotic. In this sense, Depestre epitomizes the Haitian when characterizing himself as geo-libertine-rooted nomad and Banyan man, voodooist poet in his 1998 collection of essays, Les Maîtres à Métisser. He declares négritude to be a form of being in créolité, when creativity becomes self-conscious and revolts against racism. One day, creativity entered into the countryside with Césaire's rebellion to assume our past as slaves in formal expression and to dance in our historical situation. The last sentence acknowledges the force of Césaire's pronunciation in Poésie et Connaissance, where he exerts or asserts, following Aristotle's Poetics, but a man who saves humanity, a man who replaces it in the universal concept, a man who marries the human flowering to the universal flowering. This man is the poet. Now, just footnote. I'm laying out a certain conceptual thing. I'm sketching the paper. I'm not going to give 35 pages to you. And it's a large project. But one of the key points of the project, and I'll get to that when I talk about Tunisia, is the way in which poetic expression is still a generative force in the world. Right? And we can point to concrete occurrences of this. They're still going on in Tunisia, right? where the aesthetics, the form, becomes a very strong organizing force. Even right now, when the union is failing and the technocrats are trying to seize the fervor of the revolution, but the movement to create civil society is being galvanized in artistic expression, poesy in the very broad sense. This has everything to do with what I'll talk about in a few moments about the relationship, the difference between poetry and dignity and what it's meant when we talk about dignity. As Maurice Condé has remarked, developments in the history of ideas have made the debate moot and the differences between the two Caribbean poets seem less pronounced. Still, the thing that is most germane about the controversy, to my reading of Césaire's couplet, is precisely Depestre's self-description. Even more precisely is how his itinerant life as a Marxist revolutionary so warrants that description. Beside the roaming from 1946 to 1952 that brought him to Brazil, 1 year after the public debate with Césaire, when he went to Paris, taking part in the Premier Congrès d'Artistes et Écrivains Noirs at Sargon in September of that year, 56, before returning to Haiti, only to be exiled again for his public opposition to Valier's regime, arriving in revolutionary Cuba at Che Guevara's invitation. He served the revolutionary project there in numerous official capacities until 1978, when, disagreeing with the increasing authoritarianism of Castro's regime, he returned to France, where he has remained, still alive today, since then, obtaining citizenship in 1991. In other words, reading the couplet along the lines, the same lines, as Sylvia Wynter, when Césaire transvalues the substantive marron as a verb, marron de ronler, he invokes a historical practice about the enslaved Africans in the New World to escape the confinement of the European in the fullest sense, physical, political, creating communities founded on principles other than capitalist property, and cognitively. The latter meaning in consciousness and its forms of expression. But Césaire is doing something else as well. He is speaking to Despestre, to what Despestre has already been doing, and what he and Despestre constantly do, not merely as a matter of political exigency, but also as a matter of historical being. And that should be what circumscribes their poetic form. In the 1956 reprinting of Césaire's poem, its title is changed to Le Verbe Marronner. We all know it by that title. Making the activity of flying as dynamic practice its defining character. The couplet is also revised from a transitive to an interrogative future. And the reference to the masters of the whip is dropped altogether, giving us, Mais renerons-nous, Despestre, mais renerons-nous? Shall we fly away? My departing from Elsom and Smith's translation as well as Clifford's and rendering marronner as flying is in keeping with Greg Thomas's inclination to anglicize the French verb as the phrase to go maroon, which he deploys in association with Wynter's sense of it as dynamic mode of being in distinct opposition to the ethnobiological class formations of capitalist modernity. Flying is also in keeping with the etymology and history of the term maroon, which Neil Roberts has recounted recently for us, and in that recounting underscored the socio-political connotations of being underway, or as I'll say in a few moments, in flight, apart from, together. That is to say, not so much stateless as being on the way to a state not having already belonged to or originated in a prior state. And here I am quibbling a bit with his argument about marronnage for reasons that will become apparent momentarily. In any event, Roberts has given us one of the more insightful readings of this poem, and there have been many. And his interpretation of Césaire's elaboration of marronner is as the action of social transformation in flight to the distinct concept of freedom is fully in keeping with Gustavo Pérez Firman's extraordinarily poetically critical reading of Le Verbe Marronner as both inviting and defying critical representation. It's being a potent instance of performative mimesis. The question at play here is, what is blackness as an aspect of a life in common? A careful response is being with one another in flight, apart from, which is also what is meant by the poesis of blackness as a function of parasemiosis. The second less familiar poetic line is a hemstitch from the 10th century Abbasid poet, Al-Mutanabbi. Those of us who know Arabic, this is a very famous poem. The qasida that he gives is a very famous one. Baqiya shay laysa hum irtahal. Thankfully, they are not willing migrants. Ala qalqin. And this is what got messed up. Ala qalqin, right? Got converted. Ala qalqin كأن ريح تحدي أجواؤها بجنوب وشمال. Restlessness, على قلق, as if riding the wind, steering me north or south or north. My reading of the line, however, is its recitation in 1994 by Mohammed Salah Umri in his interview with the Tunisian writer Mahmoud al-Mis'adi, who as Secretary of State for Education, Youth and Sports in President Bourguiba's post-independence government undertook institutional execution of the Education Reform Law number 58-118 of November 1958 that engendered the subjects who would come to lead the Tunisian Revolution of Dignity and Freedom. Umri's recitation was in an effort to solicit from Mis'adi some explanation of the pertinence of the concept of restlessness for his seminal work, Hadatha Abu Hurayra Qala. Just to let you know, it's a nice little joke. Abu Hurayra is a very important person in the Hadith tradition, an authority for us Sunnis, but for the Shiites, an anthem. Right? That is one. And hadatha is to say, and it's always, you have what we call an isnad, so-and-so said so-and-so, and then Abu Hurairah said, and then qal, and then you supposedly back to the moment when he's with the Prophet Muhammad. And what follows from qal is the truth, right, the prophetic truth. And Mas'adi's book was a wonderful existentialist critical engagement with that concept. The writer purported and responded promptly to the query, saying, the image is poetic. Where in the realm of poetry, imagination and imagery, I would like to point out a matter of principle. A part severed from the whole loses the meaning it acquires by being in a relationship with the whole. Taken separately, the part seems cut off, which changes its definition and meaning. Taking note of the close association of poetic expression, imagination, and imaging, which here surely entails the psychological, or in more current language, the cognitive. Al-Mis'adi's insistence that full meaning is in its association in the relationship between part and whole is striking, almost striking, and calls for some care. The line is the 17th hemstitch of Mutanabi's 30-line qasid. Too many lines to give in full, clearly. But the immediately preceding hemstitch reinforces Umri's sense of pertinence. فَمَا حَوَلْتُ فِي أَرْضٍ مَقَامٍ وَلَا أَزْمَعْتُ عَنْ أَرْضٍ زَوَالٍ. If along with Abu al-Ma'arib we read the verb asma'atu, I came to crisis, to mean I came to a decision, azmatu, in a way analogous to the classical Greek sense of crises, this line can be taken as an oxymoron. To paraphrase it, I have not tried to establish fixed residence in any one place as a homeland because I am in transit from one homeland to another while still at home. In other words, I am perpetually on the back of a camel, night and day, making it effectively my home. This is not a metaphor for perpetual travel from one place to another. Not having tried to establish a homeland means that there is no necessity to decide to leave. Nor is it a figure of exile. Rather, it is a figure of being transitional existentially. Mutanabi's figural designation for the existentially transitional, ala qalqin, which can be paraphrased as, I am on disorder and movement, or I am on the back of a restless, fast-moving beast, remaining so agitated in motion that it is as if I were riding the wind's back, directing it wherever I desire. This is a metaphor of relatively unrestricted agency and desire, of freedom. But what is meant by freedom? Mas'adi presents a way of addressing this question in his explanation of the meaning he takes from Mutanabi's lines. Restlessness means being unsettled, out of place, as in a stone that is not in its proper place in a building. By this explanation, placelessness, having no proper place of origin, in another language this is termed homelessness, in the sense of without founding mythology, which is how Mas'adi is construing ala qalqin, restlessness, is not a pitfall, but is enabled. He makes this very point when in continuing his response to Umri's query, he adds, in this respect, Abu Hurairah refers to Abu al-Tayyah's line, I sought residence in every land, but found rootedness nowhere. The lines from Abu al-Tayyah referred to is the first two hemstitches. طلبت مستقارا بكل أرض فلان أرى لي بأرض مستقارا. تعبت من طمعي فاستبعدتني ولو إني قنعت لكنت حرا. I sought settlement in every land, but saw nowhere my homeland for me. I obeyed my desires, and they enslaved me, although I was convinced I was free. It's not just that one has no homeland or has no longing for homeland, it is that one is not driven or compelled in any way by the conventions or dictates of, let us say, in an admittedly anachronistic mode, national patriotism. Put somewhat more critically, for Ataya, the truth of oneself is not defined by a relationship to the ummah, to the community, privileged by and empowered. He is, after all, the poet who famously made the Abbasid Khalif Harun al-Rashid weep by telling him that all the rewards of earthly life and power are an illusion. The perils of too carelessly identifying the political structures of the late 18th century caliphate with those of the mid-20th century nation state notwithstanding, not least of which is the presumptive inevitability of the one as the grounds of freedom, Masa'adi clearly deploys these lines to mark a certain existential condition, a certain type of human persona. Al-qalq, restlessness, is his descriptor for the existential human condition that he further elaborates is human life itself as continuous and renewed movement. Life is becoming impossibility and tragedy, he says. The person who takes on this responsibility after gaining insight or discovering feelings and ideas through thought would not be able to settle down. That person is someone who accepts the responsibility of being. Someone who goes through life as if it were an adventure, as if everything in front of him were part of his unknown. This existential restlessness is what Masa'adi advocated and sought to promulgate with his education reform. Now, time runs out, but what I do with setting up this problematic in this way is then to pick up how it echoes a very particular problematic that Bogues calls common association, both in the instance of the Haitian Revolution and in the Tunisian Revolution. And in that move, I'm trying to put forward what I call an alternative para semiotic history of revolution, where the point of reference is no longer the French or the American instance, but it becomes the Haitian. And even then, in that context, a problematic inherent to civic republicanism presents itself. And that problematic is what I put under the rubric of freedom and dignity, and it's the problematic of work. Right? Specifically the way in which the first Emancipation Proclamation given to this hemisphere was given by the governor of the west of Haiti, Saint-Ponax. And Saint-Ponax said, you're free, but you have to stay on the plantation. You can leave, but if you leave, you're going to stop. You have to work 7 days a week under the same circumstances. Because, of course, his agenda was to make sure that the commerce coming out of Haiti kept coming, right? And to sort of feed the slaves in notion of freedom. And work then becomes connected to freedom. And there's a series of laws promulgated that become labor laws that reinforce this, right? Even amazing statements like, you know, you're here for the benefit of the wealth of the plantation owners. And that's your responsibility to being free. Right? You must work. And this discourse, of course, Toussaint Louverture picks up expressly, which is what leads to the great Peasant Rebellion of 1801, but also gets embedded in the laws of the constitutions of Haiti. And it gets repeated across the Caribbean. Freedom is work. Being human is to be at labor. Now, we're in a moment in which this question of work, and we know the long tradition, I don't have to rehearse it with all of you here. Marx talks about it in this way. Work is essential. It's what constitutes this moment of becoming human. Where this question of work simply, prima facie, is a shibboleth. It's nonsense. But more importantly, it's predicated upon an old ontological proposition. And the specific events of Haiti and Tunisia show that. And there's a series of revolutions I try to walk through, where what's at stake is an effort to try to imagine dignity as not a question of being free to work, but rather of being freed from work, right? Or what the slaves used to call plantation work. And I'm on time.
We do have 50%. Could I say one thing before we continue with questions? Because I realized the instant I sat down, I had forgotten to list Joe's wonderful essay on Gramsci and the contents of the original page.
Yes. That essay which turned me into a Gramsci. Right. Which Joe well knows. And where I still remain.
You heard, I'll ask a question if I can to start. You heard Jim Livingston's talk probably last wonderful.
You know, I've talked with him about this, yeah.
Yeah.
What was supposed to be called
his
fuck work.
book. Have you got a thought about that potential consequence for your conversation about contemporary matters in Tunisia and elsewhere?
Yeah. Blackmon Construction.
In a redefinition of black along the lines of the universality of the quality, as it were, right?
Well, that would be picking up the issue of what I call parasemiosis, but,
Yes.
but in terms of the reference to Jim, precisely the opportunity that Du Bois says was necessary, and how do you get over that hurdle? You know, why does white labor not recognize its natural ally? Now, of course, the anti-work movement, which has made a lot of headway in the Netherlands, and as you will know, was its earliest proponents were Nixon Republicans, right? Who with great foresight recognized that people coming back from Vietnam were going to put a pinch on the market, and there had to be, a certain release valve. And it's still the Republicans who support it. And I wish Jim was more critical of that aspect of that project. But where there's a point of, I think, overlap or convergence is precisely it becomes a concept, right? And a discourse that can cut through the, well, I'll call it what it is, white supremacy.
So I was thinking,
And cut through the racialization of questions of power and sociality.
I was thinking of the equation of dignity and labor, right? And wondering what in post-revolutionary civil society comes of that link. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. In the imagination of the generalized civil poiesis of Tunisia, for example. That link, I presume, that traditional link is broken, it's done away with, yes?
I'm not so sure I understood what you said.
In the formations from the Haitian Revolution onward, deriving in part from not only practical need, but from the inheritance of the European Enlightenment, there was an equation made in a broad moral sense between nobility and labor, right? And that it's inseparable in some way from a particular tradition of understanding what the human is. It does not fall within the rubric of the redefinition, the parasemiosis of blackness that you're giving. So I'm asking if therefore in the kind of post-revolutionary situation in Tunisia, we would be right to look for and would we find a working function of the notion of the human that separates the labor from the
One of the points that I've tried to make in the second half of the essay is that while indeed the state promulgates that concept, under tremendous pressure, right? It was one of the conditions for the acceptance of the state into the Society of Nation States, which is important because the very reason that the French sent the 3 governors there was so they could successfully preserve civic republicanism, so that tension, that issue of necessity versus ideals of the human, is constitutive of civic republicanism. So yeah, they promulgate that, but at no point in its promulgation, beginning with the Sontanax's declaration through to the Constitution of 1801, did the population accept it, which is why in the constitutions of 1804 and 1805, that language is buried under the language of the police state, right? And even then, there's a continual series of uprisings, right? Including the civil war between the South and the North. And what we don't have, and this is what Tony is working on as well as a number of others, is a careful engagement with the archive of that thinking, right? And you see this echoed, for example, in Jamaica specifically. He likes to cite a Jamaican ex-slave who makes an announcement in 38. The province is important because when you look at the documents between the governor of Jamaica and the parliament, they're dealing with the same problem. What kind of free is this? There is indeed a dynamic practice that understands being human, divorced from work. which is why there's the phrase, this plantation work, right? The work has nothing to do with what we are. And what I'm trying to do is engage that archive, right? To show that there's a different story. And that the discourse of parasemiosis, which, you know, to be honest, this is excerpted from my book, and I've written 200 pages to show how it comes out of very specific popular poetic practices, Juba and Buzzard with its theorization, right? So there is already a tradition of thinking about the human that sidesteps this particular dilemma. And so too in Tunisia. Okay. The suburbs, a particular example one can point to. I was at an event in Kasserine 2 years ago where a number of civil society organizations are expressly trying to, well, they say, you know, dignity is about simply being able to have the right to eat bread without having to labor, toil, and be abused, right? And they're trying to pull on very specific, what they conceive of as indigenous, autochthonous conceptualizations of the human. And I've written about this elsewhere in the connection of Ness. So simply put, there's other traditions besides that one.
Yeah.
And the story that says, of course, that work is nobility and that's the way to freedom. And this is, even in the United States, I mean, there's an argument that one can stage, that I do stage, between Frederick Douglass, who's Lockean in this regard, and slaves who make counter-statements. You know, us deserve our freedom because us is sentient flesh, for instance. So to answer your question, there is an alternative, and that's what I'm trying to get at. And in fact, for me, any attempt to be able to elaborate some way of thinking forward means engaging that radical, I'll stop saying, you know, what I know to be that radical humanism, I call it, or poesis of blackness. Or broadly parasemiosis. I hope that satisfactory.
I can say more, but others need to speak.
I would love to hear more about your conception of parasemiosis as you're developing it. I mean, you have a much larger genealogy, obviously, but I mean, particularly if the inflection of Glissant is taking up some of the conceptions of semiosis developed by Bakhtin. I'm interested in the way in which this notion of this space in which poetics are made is one that's bounded, and how that can be corrected in your understanding.
Yeah. It's not simply the space where poetics is made; it's the space where poetics is making, is generative, right?
Yes.
And there's an analogy that I use at some length, but it has its inadequacies, but I think it'll address your concern. It's an empty set.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A particular case that I try to look at has to do with the notion of the visible persona. And specific instances of this are things like the actual performance of a very well-known dance called Buzzard. But also Opete, and also it's called the canoe in Cuba, and also certain practices among the Dogon and in Ife and the Fanon, much of which has been documented, in which the very concept of the individual, right, is one of infinite movement. There is no beginning, there is no end. Right? Birth is a moment, death is a moment. So it's completely not within, let's say, the Heideggerian spectrum or the ontological spectrum of a kind of rupture in the continuity of extant beings in order to make the human. But there's just this flow, right? And in that flow, there's always signification that takes place. There's always, if you will, articulations of referentiality, right? And they're multiple. So even in the case of Monodogo, where the purported individual can have something like 8 levels of iteration, right? And these aren't hierarchical, as Hurston pointed out in her great book, Tell My Horse. You know? These are cotemporal. And in that sense, the Bakhtinian model isn't satisfactory because it's bounded. So it's precisely not bounded. And that becomes the challenge. That's hence the question. What is it? What is this? How can you think of being in common without this kind of bounding? Right? I mean, I think I have an answer, but that's the challenge. I mean, it's like Valentin Dimbe, puts this point by saying, well, we need to be bounded in a particular, to speak, right? Bahol means to be bounded in some way, right? But there's a whole other way of thinking about it. There's just other ways of thinking about it, right? Mutanebi comes to mind. I invoke him to say that here are concrete ways of understanding differentiality that aren't about bindingness, where al-mubtada in Arabic is just the beginning, and the beginning is only putative, right? And it's a positionality that only works in an endless line of movement, which is why empty set sort of works, right? In fact, if you go back to Dedekind's meditations on empty set, that's exactly what he's after, right? And the way in which the generation of particular definitions is boundless, right? The axiom is only temporary. When the axiom keeps moving and it encounters that which it can't understand, it just creates some more stuff. Right? And here, of course, I'm still very much attentive to Peirce, right? And his notion of semiosis. And semiosis as a very particular constitutive activity of the world.
I mean, I don't think the Bakhtin is bounded per se, but it depends how you read him. But I take very seriously this notion, the notion of performance at the center, or the articulation of the speaking pattern, as if you put it another way.
There's that wonderful story he tells that I think exemplifies the boundedness. Right? The surf and the Lord are sitting in the small cabin in the middle of the blizzard. It's cold, there's one candle in a chair. Right? The Lord looks at the surf looks at the Lord, and the surf says, "Nu." Right? Which is, a different proposition from saying, the cat walks across my room and I merely remark to someone, and this is a real conversation. Don't worry, that's just Uncle George. Right? And it is Uncle George. Just like I'm Uncle Paul. Right? And my son is Mansour. Baqiyat hayatik. They remain in our lives as stories. Right? And of course, this way of thinking has been well documented, but dismissed by the philosophical discourse as mythical. But in fact, it's not. It's a different way of thinking, right? Which is the human is in the enunciation of the flow. I had one Ife say to me that his grandfather remarked when the British came to Nigeria. They were all perplexed. What kind of creature is this? Right? And it was about the boundedness. They only speak one language. Or, that great line that Lienhard tells on himself. You know this line, Maurice Lienhard, who had been a missionary in New Caledonia among the Kanken. After 20 years, he goes back to France, comes back, and he wants to see whether or not his missionary teachings have held. And he asks a great sculptor of the Totems, Gassou, he thinks a friendly suggestion. We brought you the spirit, right? And of course, the Count's response was, "Spirit, bah! We had the spirit. We had long before you came. What you brought us was the body." Right? And of course, Lienhard misreads that to say, "Oh, this is proof that we've brought then this very specific sense of boundedness." And Bastide corrects him some years later. He says, "No, listen to this man. He's saying, no, we don't care about your body. You've got the visibility."
Well, in order for the existential transitionality to operate, wouldn't there always have to be a boundary, some sense of that that would motivate the restlessness? Doesn't restlessness presuppose the possibility of rest and the possibility of rootedness? It seems in order to be generated, there has to be a sense of movement from an endless para. But in order for the para to do semiotic work of any kind, wouldn't there have to be that which it is in a relation of resistance to, an ongoing sense of the impossibility of resting?
Yeah, very good question.
Wouldn't there always then have to be, at least in terms of the relationship of the attitude of infinite restlessness, the possibility of finitude?
A very interesting and complicated question. I'm going to push back on the term need. And pushing back on it and saying, well, you're absolutely right. There is a point that one is apart from, as a matter of, to use a crude term, history. In the case of the embodiment of the Negro, it has to do with a certain scattering, and in that scattering, a prohibition on rootedness. And a prohibition that is so absolute that the desire for rootedness is not there. I mean, it comes back in the 70s in a perverse way with the Black Arts Movement. Right? This is one of the points that even Jean Toomer was making in his early writing, right, in that primitivist notion of the folk. And we can look at a whole plethora of tales and attitudes and stories, and personal stories, to mark the antiquity of this lack of desire for rootedness. Right? The compulsion was, let's say, the Middle Passage. Right? In the case of El-Mutanebi's home as well, the compulsion was political dissolution of people. Right? The difference, and this is the comparison of those two poetic moments, and this is the difference that El-Misadi expressly was trying to make, was, in the case of Mutanebi, an aspiration to become rooted again, to get somewhere, right? Which is, you're asking the question about, isn't there a teleology that's entailed?
The potential for a teleology.
Yeah. And of course, Mutanebi was trying to push, El-Misadi was trying to push the point, and he tried to do this in the institution of an education process by producing people who would be so burdened with so many languages, they could not even imagine a home. And he succeeded, right? So that you become like the Negro, right? At home in movement, going to the territory, flying away, right? These are expressions and tales with considerable generative force. So hence my pushing back, no, there's that historical event, right, that has created a circumstance, a particular embodiment of this restlessness.
But why then, why the embodiment at all? If it's an endless liking, it's like. What is it that would stabilize the endless movement of para as an embodiment at all?
Nothing, it's unstable.
So then the term the Negro is actually a term that is doing a kind of inculcative work, disclosing the impossibility of stabilizing in any way.
Exactly.
As the presence within the genre of the human.
I mean, one of the
calls attention to the impossibility of individualizing the genre of the human as a specific being.
It's not the only one, but it's what I call, it's not the only one by any stretch of the imagination, but you're exactly right, and it's what I call a crisis in ontology that's constituted, right? And Negro is a wonderful example because the juridical discourse is precisely destabilized, but the moment it does so, all these kind of immersion things going, and you can just take Virginia between 1631 and 1650, just that short period of time. They keep trying to enact more and more laws of stability because the more they try to specify, the more all of this stuff
scatters.
Yeah, it happens.
Order, differentiation.
Disorder.
Order and differentiation.
Disorder.
We need to have a momentary arrest. Because what we've demonstrated is how we start these processes and we never actually can close the clock.
You
But
see
we're
how
damn well
how
try.
artfully he says to me, arrête.
Well, we all understand this is a post-Althusserian moment, so that's okay.
Oh, ouch.